Mentioned before, this is the Science Education Department monthly colloquium, and we have two colleagues who have come today to talk about outside of school, after-school programs, I guess. One is Dr. Gil Noam, who who I've known for a really long time. We were both at the ed school, and we used to commiserate together over all the craziness that happened on the faculty there. Gil is unusual because he has this weird degree. He has an EDD, and he's a professor in the medical school. So associate professor of psychiatry. So he is what can I say? He is a collaborator, follower of the moral development group that was founded by Larry Kohlberg at the Ed School, which a long time ago. It has continued that work and expanded in areas of adolescent behavior and problems, particularly in the after-school, out-of-school arena. He said something in one of his papers, which I thought was pretty astute. He said these environments must remain fluid and responsive to the needs of participants, yet most institutions do not remain flexible. And I was struck because that's like what happens in classrooms as well. And every time you teach a course at Harvard, they want a full syllabus for what will happen every single day that you teach, not thinking that this might actually change based on the needs of the students. Also, we have Patty Allen. We've been working with Patty around evaluation of the evaluation instrument that was generated by the PEAR, by their group. And I want to congratulate her. She has a daughter. Very exciting.
Future scientist.
Number one, she's a scientist already at 5 months. And she said just before that all this stuff takes on new meaning when you have a little one like that and looking toward her future. But I have to say that I was particularly impressed. I went back and searched for Gil's dissertation, which I didn't find online.
Really?
No.
Well, that was before.
Was it German?
No.
Okay.
It's in the Harvard.
It's in Harvard. I'll take that out eventually. But Patty wrote an early paper that I thought was really important, which was, I'm an amateur weightlifter, and I take a supplement called creatine, which is a natural substance that is in food, but it helps you lift more weight. And she wrote a paper where she found chronic creatine supplementation alters depression-like behavior in rodents in a sex-dependent manner, meaning female rats are less depressed when they take this supplement. So I have to think about how that applies to me. Oh, there must be some. Yeah. It's obvious.
Now we know. Treatment resistant.
So I want to welcome them both to our group. We've worked with them before, and I really want to learn more about the kinds of programs and the research, the theory and research that they've gotten into. So welcome back.
So thank you so much. I guess this is working. Can we just have a short introduction? I know this takes time, but just brief, like who you are, maybe name and affiliation, or what you do. Just really brief.
Okay, Gerhard Sonnet, I work here, and we know each other.
Yes, we do. We work together. Yes, and we sometimes speak German together.
I'm Cynthia Crockett. I'm up in the SED on a couple of projects looking at professional development and also a high school science physics assessment project.
Yes. Thank you.
Hal Coyle, I'm one of Phil's project managers.
Yes.
Roy Gould in the Science Ed department, lots of experience in informal learning, science museums, planetariums. Very interested in the instruments.
Okay.
Because that's a perennial question.
Good. Yes, it is. Thank you.
I'm Daniel Castro. I'm an astrophysicist here at the High Energy Astrophysics Division, and I'm a mission planner for Space Telescope.
Wow.
Yeah.
I feel intimidated.
In terms of, I might have to run out of the room in the middle.
Just touch on gravitational waves and black holes.
Okay, I will.
I'm Harry Houghton, and I'm an education specialist here in the Science Ed department.
I'm Jason Wiles. I'm a visiting scholar in Science Ed and professor of biology at Syracuse University.
Okay, yes.
I'm Wendy from Untitled Chapter.
Right, we have communicated.
I'm Pat Udon-Persert. I'm the project director for the Worldwide Telescope Ambassadors Program. We design educational curricula, mostly in formal environments, middle school. And I do a lot of collaborative work with the folks here at SCD.
Great.
I'm Erin Johnson, and I work with Pat and the folks at SCD.
Okay, same
Same
project, middle school.
Same project,
Okay.
middle school.
I'm Sue Sunbury. I work up in SED, a lot of formal and informal projects. Sitting next to us virtually is Mary DeSalt. She's saying hello from afar. You know, and is also
Yes.
working on a lot of informal projects.
Yeah. Erica Wright, I work in SED on many of our informal projects. I have a background in museum education, so I'm very interested.
I see. Okay.
So I'm Angela Hahn. I'm actually not affiliated with Harvard, but I sometimes work in informal science education, so Erica let me tag along this morning.
Great.
I'm John Murray. I run online assessments for the
I see, great. So, so this is a great group. You come together once a month, right? But not necessarily everyone shows up, so this, okay. So, oh, hi. So it might be a little confusing, like these different strands at school, psychiatry, out of school time. So I just want to just briefly give you a sense of how this kind of links. So the background is, for me, is clinical child psychology. So not education, but really the whole kind of question of what it takes to kind of build resiliency in young people. And the work started at really Harvard Medical School, postdocs, clinical therapy, but a lot of the work was waiting kind of for young people to get sick enough that they need treatment in some facility, either outpatient or inpatient. And I learned a tremendous amount in the process, but I was always very dissatisfied with the idea that we kind of let people become so sick, especially young people, and not really reach out to be where they are, either for treatment or even better for prevention. And there was one kind of issue. The second issue was that when I came to Harvard, there were two different worlds. One was the psychiatric world, which was developmental, but focused on Freudian ideas of development. And right next to it were the developmental psychologists at William James Hall and the School of Education, who were built on Piaget. And they never really talked to each other, and it never influenced each other. And yet they really belonged together, somehow an understanding of early attachment patterns and what can go wrong, and the kind of regressive potential that we all have as human beings, and simultaneously the more Piaget-oriented kind of progressive way in which people make sense over the course of their life cycle and really kind of structure their experiences. So that was a lot of the work, was kind of connecting those two. And in the process, it became clear that a really radical developmental understanding of human beings and their problems and symptoms really takes us also outside of clinical settings and really gets us more into the educational space. And we also found in a longitudinal study that, in fact, there were two factors that predicted the well-being of young people who in adolescence were actually in hospitals, like really as inpatients. And one was educational attainment. So did they then go to high school finish high school and potentially go to educational experiences after that. That was one that was really distinguishing those kids who did well over a long period of time and those who didn't. And the second one was the relational quality of the lives of the young people, with a very strange finding, which was actually that those patients who had children, the girls or women who had children at a young age, were actually doing better over time than those girls that didn't. And yet our whole idea was that, pregnancy and child rearing for young women was a big risk factor. But in fact, what we found was that the relational quality with the family and also in the hospital was critical to the well-being. And what we also found, which was very interesting, was that the young people asked maybe 5 years later, who was your psychiatrist who saw you while you were in the hospital? The great majority couldn't even remember the name. But when you asked them about the child care worker, who was that person who was much more behavioral, makes no money compared to the clinical staff, they remembered a lot. So there was kind of a sense of the kind of concrete relation. That doesn't mean that the psychiatrists and psychologists didn't have a role, but it didn't have a role in the kind of memory of the young people around kind of getting better. So anyway, without getting into that too deeply, those two experiences led us even more dramatically into the schools. Because it really meant that the teacher and other people in the school play a huge role in the well-being of young people. Not only the educational well-being, but the well-being in general. And it also meant that if educational attainment, graduation rates are so important for mental health, education and mental health really belong together. And in fact, now that this was a while back, now insurance companies pay minute amounts, like for a week or 2 weeks of crisis intervention, but the kids are really for 12 years and now even 14 years in school settings. So just imagine if we reorganize that well and really focus in on thriving as well as academic work, what an opportunity we have, longitudinally. So that's where the development comes in. So now you can ask the last question, what does that have to do with science and with out-of-school time? And the answer is very simple. So we did a lot of work in Boston. And at the time, it's gotten a little better, but at the time, you could have a great program in schools, and I think we did, and we showed kind of real results. But students left at 1:35 in the afternoon. So it went against everything you know about sleep patterns, circadian rhythms. They had to get up at 6 o'clock, be bussed, although it's not called bussing anymore, it's called walking and non-walking. So the non-walkers had to get up, let's say in Dorchester, with many, many stops to get to their school by 7 o'clock. And then they were there from 7 to 1:35, and then they were on their own. And we have this idea of poverty means people are not working. In the contrary, these are kids whose mothers, usually mothers, work 3 jobs and they were in charge of everything. And so it became clear in the kind of around 1999, 2000, that we have to, as a society, solve the out-of-school time whole. That really kids, latchkey children as they were called then, were like a real social problem. So that's how I got into this idea that actually mental health is much bigger than I thought. I thought it was a school-based mental health. You bring some of the services into where the students really are. But it really became clear that out-of-school time is a social experiment around prevention. The biggest risk factors for young people were in the out-of-school time. And even though we hear about school shootings, the real idea is here that schools are the safest place young people are. safer than families in a certain way because there is a lot of abuse in families, and definitely safer than what's happening out of school. So it wasn't really, the issue is not really safety in schools. The issue is that between 1:35 and whatever, 7 o'clock when parents show up, or 8 or 6 o'clock, there is a lot of risk behavior that happens. There's one statistic that I saw that I still find very amusing and amazing, that girls tend to get pregnant at 4:35. When they do, or if they do. I have no idea how they actually did this study, but they did some kind of time analysis, and that was actually the riskiest times for becoming pregnant for girls. Again, an example of out-of-school time. Gang behavior, so lots of public safety issues were at stake. At the same time, so I got very interested in that, both from a mental health perspective and from an education perspective. So the education part, which was really super interesting, was it was just the beginning of No Child Left Behind. And there was a sense that public safety is only one element of this, parental employment the other, but the third big one is that we need more time on task, and this out-of-school time space between, let's say, 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock is a huge educational kind of bonus time. If you take that times 5, that's a lot of hours. And so this whole, I felt very privileged because you can see how much I got away from the original clinical questions and more into the questions of how do you actually create environments, youth development environments that are productive for young people, where they learn, that connect to their school day and to the academic kind of vision of schools without becoming a longer school day. So a lot of the fighting that happened was, let's not make this a longer school day. If it doesn't work in the hours that school has available, why do we think that making it longer will be more effective? So the whole point was to really create innovation. And that has been like an incredible, like Boston as an example, an incredible time of innovation where lots of kind of nonprofit organizations and social entrepreneurs and foundations said, look, we're not giving up on schools, but we're not going to invest a huge amount of our energy in schools because they're so bureaucratic. Let's really create something kind of after school and in the summers, and then hopefully also integrate some of this work into the school day. And I think that actually has happened. There's a huge amount of social innovation, charter schools, things that are happening. Schools today, 10, 15 years later, do not look like they did some years ago. So now the last piece is, what does this have to do with science? So we had the resiliency part kind of as part of our work, but we wanted a proof point that actually kind of made after school academic without making it like school. And there was nothing as strong and as good as STEM or science. First of all, science had NSF behind it and the museums. Someone mentioned the museums. So the whole kind of tradition of informal science. So there was something already there and something that was looking for a home beyond museums. So it was a natural step to take what was created over 20, 30, or 40 years and bring it into an educational setting. And the other part of it was that it was a proof point for us to say, you can do something very different. It's playful, it's experimental, it's enjoyable, and it connects to the academic kind of mission of schools. And in fact, if you do it well in the after school, the hope was that actually teachers would also say, well, this kind of informal science approach to science learning is much better than book learning. And we should actually make it. And that's actually happening. I think slowly but surely that people see that there's something happening there. Okay, so this is the background. So for us, you know, we could have also invested in English learning or math or whatever, but we felt science is really kind of a really powerful thing. And you will see in the data, if I still have time, because the introduction is kind of becoming the core part of the presentation, that that it is really the connection between socio-emotional learning, which is another term I want to just introduce, with STEM that actually makes this marriage really have children. So what I mean with that is that the mental health work that we've done for so many years has found its time. And the time is now, because schools, after No Child Left Behind, with the frustration that kind of academic learning is not working well by just having more tests and more kind of accountability, that something else has to happen. People have opened up towards the idea that the whole child does matter, that emotional aspects of learning are important, that exploration is important. And so that has led for schools and districts to kind of open up to this idea that socio-emotional sides of development are really essential, and that engagement in learning becomes essential. So that's where we are right now, that actually all the districts, with Cambridge, Boston, but nationally, are saying, tell us what socio-emotional learning is, what is resiliency, and how do we build it, and how do we make sure that young people get engaged in their learning, become partners, how do we personalize learning? So all of these buzzwords are coming together. And with that, and this is kind of the last piece that you have to have for this kind of background, with that comes also a post-No Child Left Behind idea of data. So we are in this kind of confusing situation where on the one hand, people are sick and tired in education of any kind of testing because they see it as kind of the wrong direction, that it has led to a kind of estranged way of learning. But simultaneously, people are kind of through technology into personalized learning. So for example, Facebook has a big initiative on personalized learning. So kind of using computer-assisted ways of assessing where a child's mentality is, where a child's abilities are, and then kind of figuring out through computer programs how you support a child's learning, not based on the classroom, but based on the individual child. And so data becomes hugely important. So we are kind of in this kind of situation where we have to, on the one hand, kind of apologize for being data-oriented, and at the same time, being kind of supported by lots of people who are saying this is an incredible opportunity because we can now really in big ways assess what we're doing. And so the last piece of that idea is that in the out-of-school time, people in the original space wanted to just use school-based data. So if you have a good after-school program, it should actually make a difference in the accountability testing. And a lot of my work and my team's work was actually to push hard against that and say, no, the after-school programs should be assessed based on their own goals. And so the compromise that was found was say, okay, we'll let you kind of do your own assessments, but you have to do assessments. If we give you public money, 21st Century Community Learning Center money, Department of Education, we're willing to kind of not do the accountability testing, but you then, as a field, define what those assessments are. And that's where kind of the STEM, this is full circle, where we decided we really needed to figure out an assessment system for STEM and also for SEL, because our idea is that actually when you do good STEM in out-of-school time or in schools, you also learn socio-emotional skills and 21st century skills, such as teamwork, perseverance, problem solving. I mean, these are all the kind of workforce skills that people want and are putting pressure on schools to teach. So this is like, I think like I've described 25 years of work in a short time, and I feel lucky that I was able to grow with the field and to have such great collaborators to do that together with. But I think it will give you a sense that this is both about STEM, both about assessment, but it really is in a bigger way about a new vision of education and the place of assessment in that vision. And all this is in the making. It's half-baked, so to speak, but we have made a lot of progress. So with that, I want to start showing you a couple of slides. So this is actually the reason why No Child Left Behind has not worked. And, or not the reason, but the kind of description of how it hasn't worked. And sadly, the Obama administration went along with the Bush years for about 6 years, trying to continue that until they also realized it's not working. So what this is, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP scores that are used for national kind of tracking of student change. And this is the literacy data for 13-year-olds between 1971 and 2012. It hasn't changed very much. And so what you see here is that, first of all, you see a huge gap that continues into today between African American children and white children. But you also see practically no increase. So my policy colleagues and friends say this is a resilient statistic. But I think from my perspective, resilience is something different. But from their perspective, it means nothing changes. And you see here, actually, for African American boys, their proficiency levels in 1988 were higher than in 1994 and weren't that much lower than they are today. So this is like after billions and billions of dollars have been invested in reading, language arts in general, and math. Okay. So this is where we actually took things to a kind of assessment of after-school programs and tried to figure out, so what can we do to learn what's happening there? And we did a study with the Noyce and Mott Foundation funding in 11 states. And we want to briefly kind of describe this to you. So there are these networks in different parts of the country where after school is being coordinated. And we took from those states that have a STEM coordinator. And then we even have a smaller sample because this is in 50 states. We took 11 states, 160 informal STEM programs, and nearly 1,600 youth and 148 facilitators. So this was a real opportunity to do a pretty big study. And here's, I'm really jumping in without giving you a lot of background, but we will show you in a few minutes like what we use to measure. But as a result here, an important piece, so let me tell you just a little bit, an important piece in the out-of-school time space is that we have gotten funders to back off on outcome research until there's quality research conducted. And this is very important. So in other words, are these programs actually doing strong STEM work? Or are they just claiming they're doing STEM work? What does it even mean when they say we're doing STEM? Is it a one-time module that takes like 2 hours? Is it home-baked? Someone like a facilitator just produced something? Or is it a high-level thing developed by the Boston Science Museum that is like, 2 months long? So what are we really talking about? So that's where actually we first looked at the quality. And what this shows is, without you knowing anything about the measures, that when you take certain constructs and you look at the outcomes of the young people and you connect it to observations, real-life observations of the context, the learning context themselves, and you take blue as the highest group of quality, the highest quality, and orange the lowest quality, you can see that on a number of dimensions, in fact, all dimensions, STEM interests, STEM career interests, STEM career knowledge, STEM identity, and STEM activities, these strong programs also produce the highest outcomes. I mean, you might say this is trivial, but it isn't, because you really, beforehand, people say, let's invest a lot in the the quality, but you didn't have proof that actually the investment in quality will really produce better outcomes. This is very important also for schools. You know, what teachers actually produce the best outcomes? We don't know yet exactly what the variables are. So we actually in the out-of-school time have better measures now, not just for STEM, but for the general quality of the environment than we have for schools and classrooms. Because that has been such a focus in the out-of-school time. So yeah, go, continue. We don't need that. So I think we should just for a moment kind of go into an example of what is quality kind of from a STEM side. And so we want to do this together. Okay.
Okay, we're going to make flubber today, guys. Now, what you've got in front of you, in the big cup, you've got a mixture of glue and water. In the little cup, you've got a solution of borax in water. And the borax is a catalyst. And what it's going to do, it's going to react with the glue that is in your cup, and it's going to make a semi-solid polymer called flubber. So what I want you to do, I want you to take the little cup and pour it into the big cup. All of it. And as soon as it's all in there, all of it, quickly. You don't have to do it slow. And then take your spoon and start stirring. Hold the cup with your hand and stir. Stir. Pick your spoon up and then plunge it back down and stir around. And how's yours doing, Christian? How's yours, Callie? Hold it with the other hand, baby. Hold the cup with your hand. And now stir it really good. Stir.
Oh my God.
How you guys doing? Stir. How's yours? Okay, now lift it up like this. And stick it back down. Like that a couple times like a washing machine. There you go. How you guys doing? How's yours, Cameron?
I think mine's still stirring. Oh, it's already gotten sticky. It can't stir anymore.
Okay, now keep stirring. Sebastian, how's yours looking? Good? Your flubber is not going to absorb all of the water. So what I want you to do now is I want you to take your spoon and pull your spoon out until it breaks free of the flubber. Once it breaks free of the flubber, you can use your other hand to pull it loose. Set your spoon on the table. Set your spoon on the table.
With the flubber connected to it?
The flubber can be connected to it. Just pick it up, so hold it like this. Now pull your spoon. Pull the spoon. Now set the spoon on the table. Come on, get your spoons out. Grab it with your fingers and pull it off. Now just set it on the table. Okay, now set it on the table. Oh, you think that's gross? Wait till you see what we do next. Get your spoon out of the flubber.
It's really,
Pull it out and leave it there.
It's really like...
Okay, now get your spoon out of the flubber and set it on the table. Take your spoon out of it. Take the spoon out of the flubber and set it on the table. Set it on the table. Leave whatever little bits of flubber on the spoon. Leave it on there. Now comes the fun part. I want you to reach into your cup, grab hold of your flubber and pull it straight up.
Oh my gosh!
Pull it straight out. Now once you got it out, grab it with both hands and start playing with it in both your hands. Just like these guys are doing. Get it out. Don't worry. Pull it straight up, Sebastian.
Okay, we can continue, but because of time, I think you get the idea. So let's just have a short discussion about you know, the quality of this environment, and then I'll show you the instrument itself, how we measure. But, you know, are the kids having fun? Yeah. So it's engaging, right? It's because when people think about out of school time, although this could also be a classroom during the school day, they're supposed to have fun, right? So they're having fun, and the ooh and ah, and you know, there's a lot of kind of engagement. Is there a lot of peer interaction? So it's very kind of oriented towards the teacher and instructions from the teacher. So what would you say, like if you would be a visitor to the school with a science background, as you all have here, what would you tell the people? You know, what to do better, what to continue doing the way they're doing it, from a science learning perspective? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like, you know, the step by step, you're all going to do this, you're going to do this. Like, I thought that was an amazing thing from like a classroom management point of view, that the kids were all actually following the steps and not flinging things at each other. But from like a learning point of view, they're like following the steps, like it's like a recipe, but it's not clear to me that they understand why they're doing it, what's supposed to happen, what's going to come out of it.
Yeah, and you have to trust us that we didn't stop at the moment when the teacher suddenly had a wonderful classroom discussion. So it stayed this way.
Building on what Pat said, I think there's also not, there's no like curiosity about why, and no like questioning.
Yeah, like predictions, like what do you think is going to happen if you pour this into this?
Right. So no cognitive kind of element. It's more like the hands-on. Definitely hands-on. I mean, literally.
Fun.
Yeah, and fun. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think that they were all working individually rather than pairing them up and giving one an ingredient to each one that they're responsible for, and they can talk about that particular ingredient first before they combine it to get this polymer that they make.
Yeah. So no interaction, no kind of co-construction that we would find very important. Yes.
There's no aspect of recording, observing, interacting about what is happening.
Right.
To analyze or just discuss either in pairs or in a group what is happening amongst themselves.
Right.
Like, why is mine sticking and yours isn't? Or what are you doing differently?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
write it down and talk.
Yeah. So they're not learning how to be scientists. They're learning how to actually do something.
Follow directions.
Follow directions.
And with that, just to follow up on the prediction part of it, that they're focusing on the grossness of the product rather than the surprise that two liquids should lead to something like that. So I think spending much more time in the beginning.
Yeah. Why are we doing this?
Why?
Yeah. Go ahead.
There was a whole lot of high-level vocabulary in terms at the start that just blew right on by them, and really wasn't essential. And you know, it would have been interesting to have the kids, you know, what is this? Like Pat said, you know, what do you think this is, and you know, why do you think we're doing those kinds of things without the technical terms that are lost on them.
Right.
How old are these kids?
Around 10, let's say. Late elementary.
The latency age, I mean, middle child.
Some of them, some are really young.
Well, old enough that they need it, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there was definitely a kind of division between mouth and hands. That's already a developmental accomplishment.
It might have happened, but I didn't see it. I mean, these ingredients are typically Elmer's glue and like 20-multene borax. So those are objects that the kids have probably seen before.
Right.
And so
make it
any
relevant.
Connection, any relevance to their world is lost by having these two unidentified substances.
So let's just move beyond this, but it just shows you the complexity for millions of young people. Now you have this new setting. I mean, in this case, it's a classroom that is opened up for after-school activities. You have materials, you have organization. I mean, that in itself isn't like a given. I've seen after-school programs like in cafeterias where kids would use this to kind of throw at each other, and you have adults kind of starting to yell like sometimes happens in schools, just to keep order. So the fact that this is actually, so we have to recognize that this is hands-on, this is engaging, this is fun. So there's a lot of that going on. But when you get to the next level of what is this in terms of science learning, you really fall very short. And that's kind of where the field is. They're really saying, look, we don't want just engaging fun activities. We want young people's minds to be kind of enlarged. And so this is where we can get to the next part, which is actually what? Let's just continue. How do you define STEM quality? And this is like a slide that really took us probably to fill in took us probably 8 years. And we started with a grant from the National Science Foundation where we said, look, we have all these consensus reports. I was part of one, which was the NRC group that really talked about informal science and did a report in 2008. But there was also one that NSF had assembled, and where people were saying, look, these are kind of elements that really make for good informal science learning. And then we applied this to out-of-school time because we see it as a youth development, kind of resiliency developing field. So we came up with these larger kind of units, features of the environment, activity engagement, STEM knowledge and practices, and youth development in STEM, all focused on STEM. So it's not like in general, but let's say we see an activity for an hour. Let's actually see it, observe it, and see whether we can come up with reliable codes that actually have different, people. Like you were highly reliable as a group, right? No one said like the opposite of someone else. So I think there is actually a lot of ability one has to have a consensus quite fast. But now to create a measure around it is really another kind of level. And so if you go down this list for flubber, I think we have this in here. No? So you take let's say activity engagement. And is there evidence absent? Is the evidence inconsistent? Is it reasonable evidence? And is it compelling evidence? So that's what you have. You have 4 elements to score. So there's minimal evidence that students are engaged with hands-on activities where they can explore STEM content. There's weak evidence and so on. So it's kind of behaviorally organized. So if we can just go back for 1 second. So if we just let's say two of these. Inquiry. For what you saw, if you would have seen this for an hour, what rating, if you had to give 1 to 4, where does inquiry fall without you having the definitions here? 1. Okay, right? Pretty much. I mean, there wasn't a lot of evidence that there were questions asked that would actually lead to inquiry. Purposeful activity. 3. Okay, why 3? Why not 2? Why not 4? Or 2? Well, no, we don't allow for that. I wanted to. Everyone wants to, like 2.5. But our methodological consultants say, yeah, you can do that, but then you have an 8-point scale. So do you want an 8-point scale? And we said, no, it's hard enough to get 4 reliability around 4 points, right? But why would you say? So let's play with 2.
Maybe because there was the recipe, and you saw the recipe being delivered
right.
succinctly.
Yes.
In steps.
Yeah.
Grudgingly.
Yeah. So it was purposeful in the sense they weren't just doing some weird thing that no one understood, and there wasn't a sequence. But it wasn't right. But it wasn't purposeful in the sense of clarity around STEM learning, and that's why we would give it a lower rating, even though it was purposeful. Okay, so let's take one other one: engagement with STEM. So you saw here a group of people being very engaged. So what rating would you give that? 2? With STEM, exactly.
If they were engaged with the
Right.
But the STEM aspect of that was off.
Yeah. Yeah. So this. Yeah. Yeah. So exactly. I mean, so you can see that this isn't just a way to have a measure. It's a way of actually training people who are not STEM specialists and saying, look, this is a 2, and we wouldn't use the word, the number 2. We would just say, here's where you can increase your competency if you actually connect the engagement with your STEM outcomes, what you really want to have them do. Similarly, I mean, youth voice, this is where the psychological side comes in. A lot of, I mean, they could say ooh and yuck, but that's not really strong youth voice. It's a little, so it would be more than one, but we would want to see a little more leadership opportunity and voice. Relevance, you've already mentioned, you didn't see relevance. So you could see that if you would use that, the materials were good, the organization was strong, so you would have a profile. Wouldn't all be negative, but in general around STEM it would be pretty low quality, even though it looks like a lot of fun. And that's kind of where this, just the way we talk is the way we talk to teachers and after-school providers in order to kind of show them what it is that they need to kind of learn and how they can hone their skills. So with that, I want to hand it over to my colleague, Patty.
Gil. Gil just talked about quality, and we know that out-of-school time has very different settings, very different ways of defining things, different kinds of activities, and so Gil talked about, observations to define quality and to have a common language around communicating what we mean by inquiry, what we mean by relevance. But there are different sources of information, and we don't believe that observations are the only important source of information, especially if you want to know if the investments that you are making in quality and understanding whether activities are meaningful and have purpose, that how do you know what your return on investment, or if you're thinking about what are areas I need to improve, who else should I talk to? Gil mentioned that one of the people, one of the important sources that people remember are the teachers and the educators, the people leading STEM, and the other is just the student themselves. And Phil had alluded to the fact that I had worked at a lab bench for many years with rats, studying brains, amplifying DNA. One thing I was always jealous of were my colleagues who were talking to people who can actually ask somebody, what are you thinking, instead of inferring what they're thinking. So I think that student surveys are one of the most undervalued tools that we have, especially from understanding a student's perspective about how they feel about something. And so the common instrument actually came about because people wanted to know what is really engaging students in STEM, what might be some of the properties or characteristics that really have students continue along in STEM, maybe take more electives or majors in STEM, or actually get a career in STEM. So the common instrument about 10 years ago, so this is a lot of both tools, informed by research, but also informed by practice. So it was inspired by the National Research Council's report saying, hey, we need to focus more on motivation or some of these affective components, interest, and to really inform engagement. And this is also coming from people who are actually in the field teaching, saying, we have a lot of different activities. I might be launching a cannon with a trebuchet or flying a kite, but one thing that we think everybody has in common is interest. Some students have it and some don't. Why is that? And how many students in our program feel either positively or negatively about STEM? So we developed a short form called the Common Instrument with this goal, and we developed it, and actually I should say that Gil led the development of the Common Instrument with youth-serving organizations who really helped us figure out what the right questions were to ask in out-of-school time. It's different from in-school time. And since then, we've actually expanded it because it turns out that interest was very popular, but people then wanted to know more. Students really told them a lot about their programs. What else can we learn? And so we started to adapt some of the items from the PISA survey, which is an international survey. I see a lot of head nodding, so I won't go too much into it. But we readapted it because it's developed for 15-year-olds, which most of the out-of-school time programs in STEM really serve elementary school, maybe middle school, but the language was too challenging. But we looked at things like career interest. career knowledge and participation in STEM outside of school, even outside of out-of-school time programs. And then Gil alluded to the socio-emotional learning, kind of these 21st century skill aspects, relationships with peers and adults, which actually are a really good predictor of how well somebody does in school, but also there is a relationship between those outcomes and STEM learning. So if you're not having a good time, you're not really on a team, or you're not really collaborating and having good relationships with your facilitators or with your peers, how can you focus on what you're trying to learn? So we started to develop this out, and then finally kind of uniting these two areas were identity, because we started to notice and we started to hear from programs that, I feel like some of my students would be more engaged if they really could see themselves as scientists. So this we added to ask students, do you see yourselves as scientists? And so this collectively became the Common Instrument Suite, and there are a number of outcomes that programs, depending on what they want to learn from their students, can kind of pick and choose from these different kinds of scales and interests. So, and then finally, this slide is less kind of decorated with stuff because it's something that we're working on. The facilitator survey is another source of information. You want to know who's teaching outside of school time or leading STEM activities out of school time, and what level of training have they had, generally in out of school time, and then specifically in STEM. But also what kind of professional development have they had in leading STEM activities, and what do they wish they had? So I'm going to tell you, kind of just showing you an example of how we've applied this. This is beyond the 11 state data that Gil shared, but there is a growing network of communities across the United States who really want to understand the quality of their STEM activities outside of school, as well as hearing from students and hearing from facilitators. And so I'm just highlighting here 6 locations that we're currently working with, but are part of a larger STEM ecosystem initiative to really use a data-driven approach using common tools. And the benefits of common tools is that they're developed based on research. They undergo rigorous psychometric testing. They're also field tested, and we're getting feedback from the field about what works and what doesn't. And they're also specific enough that programs can learn about how they're doing, so formative assessment, strengths and challenges to programming, but also good for continuous monitoring and progress, continuous progress updates. And then finally, they're general enough that you can compare. So not only can you compare within your program, you can compare and learn from other programs who might be doing really well in inquiry, for example, and suddenly you have a language to say, hey, I only got a 2 at inquiry, what are you doing to get the 3s and 4s? But then you can also compare across nationally and look at trends on a national level. And so we started to do that and by the way, it takes a village. There are a lot of people involved in this work. The students who are attending the programs, the people who are leading it, the people who are directing the programs, the foundations who are funding this work, all different kinds of people. And a lot of goals, and I know with the time I can't really get into a lot of them, but one is to think about national trends. How can we inform policy? How can we bring communities together both locally and nationally to collaborate and learn from one another, but also to bridge the gap between research and practice? And also to be educational in the way of bringing resources and professional development, for example, so that people understand what we mean by quality and how you can lead STEM activities so that students leave being really excited about what they did and thinking about how they can stay involved and continue to do STEM activities. So here's sort of a snapshot of our logic model. The idea is that you plan, you think about how can I make this activity that I have kind of fit with these elements of quality like inquiry and relevance and STEM content learning, that sort of thing. And then you do your activity and you do it to the best that you can. But then you check. You kind of go back and say, with observations, maybe using the DOS tool or another tool, and you use surveys to find out from students if they felt really engaged or if they care about getting a career in STEM. And you learn from that, and then you act by either maybe trying a different activity or revisiting the activity you did and making it better and trying to figure out what you can do better. And there are different ways to do that. So I'm going to just show you really briefly kind of a snapshot of some data that we've collected over the last 2 years. In these 5 different communities, this is representative of 3,751 students between K and 12, about 50% female. This is kind of a snapshot into who is in the out-of-school time, landscape. Importantly, more than half were from traditionally underserved groups, so we're talking about female students, females who identify as African American, Latino, Native American, and more than half spoke a language other than English at home. So that means that out-of-school time programs play a really important role in reaching these underserved students. This is a quick snapshot of DOS, what we're seeing in terms of quality. And just as we expected, programs are really good at organizing, having the right materials, using the space well, and really fostering relationships. But the areas that they're still challenged by, and by the way, the dotted line's kind of the criterion that you kind of hope people will reach. The meatier areas like inquiry and reflection, even relevance, are kind of below that mark. So those are the areas that really, this continued investment in understanding how to improve these activities, that work is still ongoing. So we can't say, haha, we've done it. There's still more work to go, but fortunately there are a lot of tools and methods that can help you kind of improve in those areas. This is just showing you, I won't linger on this, that you can also compare their reference points. So although in this sample there were certain areas that could be improved, they're still doing better than the national average that we have. It's a database based on 600 observations where there isn't this community-wide support. So it means that there was progress if you look to another standard, another reference point. And who's leading STEM? So this is just a quick snapshot. Tends to be mostly female, very highly educated people, usually a bachelor's degree or higher. And one thing to note, though, is that about 50% of the people who responded to this survey reported that they had only been leading STEM out of school time for less than a year. And there's a high turnover rate in out of school time. And so this is a question of, well, if I'm going to invest in quality, but then we lose the staff. So how do we kind of keep people involved in leading out of school time STEM? Maybe if we support them more, but I can leave that open to discussion. How do facilitators feel about leading STEM? Actually, more than 90% are very positive about leading STEM. They really like it. They feel more interested after leading STEM. They feel they are more able to lead STEM, and they feel more confident about leading STEM. And if you ask them about how they feel they've impacted their students, I know the slide's a little hard to read, but basically the gist is that they do feel like they're having a positive impact in terms of their science skills, technology skills, engineering skills, and their the confidence of their students. However, you'll note that math was the lowest, so facilitators felt less confident that they had really impacted students' math skills. So that was sort of an intriguing finding here. If you ask them what kind of professional development they wish they had, most would say, I need help leading and teaching STEM, which is their primary job. So that's sort of a really important finding. How do we bring that to facilitators? Other were kind of just what kind of ideas, curriculum ideas, that sort of thing. And then finally, when you get to ask students, which I love to do, again, when you're trying to ask a rat, it's really hard to know what they're thinking. But if you ask a student, they'll tell you. And, what we're seeing here is that most students, between 70 and 80%, are enjoying STEM activities outside of school, and they're really interested in it. But where it starts to go down in terms of by the way, this is retrospective reporting. If you feel like you've changed or not, so about the same or different, that 58% felt that they did have a positive change in seeing themselves as a scientist, but that means another 42% didn't feel any change or maybe felt more negatively about themselves participating. So those are sort of the areas. Also STEM career knowledge, 65% reported, hey, I do know about jobs in STEM and maybe want to get a job in STEM, but that leaves a gap of what about this other group of students? Why don't they? And then the 21st century skills. Actually, across the board, and this is not surprising because most out-of-school time programs started in the youth development field before they evolved into STEM programming. They are doing really well. That more than 80% of students, about 80%, reported positive change in their relationships with others, especially peers, and critical thinking and perseverance. So that's a really positive outcome. So with that, Gil, I didn't know if you wanted to contribute to some of our sort of take-homes.
Yeah, no, I would love to have a little. How much time do we have for discussion?
Well, we can maybe even have discussion over pizza. So pizza's almost arrived.
Okay.
So we have to be out by 12:15. So we have 25 minutes.
Oh, good. So thank you. I mean, this was a
crash course in data.
Tour de force, but I think there are a couple of learnings here that we'd like to end with. The first one is these findings are quite solid. I mean, in other words, we find them in many different studies now. So the 11-state study that I mentioned originally, which is different from the Hubs study that Patty showed you, is very similar. The other thing is that we're kind of convinced that the measures are pretty good. Not sure they're great, but they're, maybe good enough, is because we found lots of differences between different settings. So Patty showed you the averages, but there are differences with the states. We had a few states that were really stars, and we could actually track down what the things were that they were doing. Much better outcomes than other states that were at the bottom. So there is really that the data does differentiate. The third thing is that there's a big question which we could maybe discuss between pre and post. That whole space around self-report and pre and post is really messy. And so we were very lucky to work with Garrett and Phil on this kind of self-report. We worked for a year now, and we owe you a draft, we realize, in order to actually get that published, which is the Common Instrument, not the Common Instrument suite, but we did a lot of psychometric work, and it's been really a great collaboration. But the issue is when you do this pre and post, the way people really like to have data presented, most attitudinal tests don't show a lot of change. Even if you know that the kids have changed. And, the reporting bias is typically seen as the issue. So especially with STEM. I love STEM, I'm really good at STEM, and, all that stuff. And then they do STEM, and they suddenly realize this is really tough. So there's a new frame that gets created at the end that's different than at the beginning. So it's kind of a bias that gets shifted, or a shift that comes through bias. And so when you have that at the end, that some people say, well, I'm not so good, not as good as I thought. Some people have grown, some people have realized it's more difficult, but that's growth. And some people have gotten less interested, and you average this out, you typically have a kind of flat line. Mm-hmm. And so that's why people are moving more towards a retrospective pre-post design, which has its own problems, but it's basically one where at the end, you say, rate yourself how you were in the beginning and rate yourself how you are now. So at least you have only one frame. But of course, the problem is you retrospectively might evaluate yourself differently, and that's good, but it might also be because your memory, especially the older you get, gets a little shaky. And so you have that problem. And then we have a third version, which is the one we showed you, which is don't even think about how you were in the beginning. How do you evaluate your change, period? So we have actually three methods, and it's interesting that the further you get from the pre, the stronger the results. So if you ask kids, like, have you changed? They give you stronger results than when you typically ask them retrospective pre-post, and definitely stronger ones than the pre-post. And so we're at a very exciting time, because we have to get that working out, because otherwise we're going to continuously kind of create wonderful interventions, and we won't show the results, and the funders will stop funding. So that's why we're trying to educate funders to actually be more open towards the retrospective pre-post approach, which we feel is a little stronger than just the retrospective, because it still has a pre-post kind of element in it. But we'd love to kind of discuss it. And the last thing to show you is that dip, what we call a double dip around the quality, is serious. I think that shows you that a number of things like organization and other things are working quite well, but that even the things that after-school programs are supposed to be strong in, like youth development, relevance, and so on, are not so strong. And that the things that are most important for STEM, inquiry, reflection, that whole process is quite weak still in this field. But now we can take that to funders and to youth-serving organizations like the YMCA, the Boys and Girls Club, that are really serving millions of kids, and say, let's build up a system. So what's happened now is that there are kind of a number of professional development organizations that are buying into DOS. So what's interesting here for you, I think, is that measurement is not just about measuring and evaluating. It is also where researchers can contribute good thinking. I hope it's good thinking. But strong thinking about constructs, which is what we're taught to do and to produce, and create frameworks. So now it's not anymore, I want this, I want that. We can say, well, this is a framework for quality. And what's really great is what NSF wanted from the beginning. They said, look, if you create this well and you have evidence behind it, why don't we give that to people who are creating, let's say, a museum exhibition, which is actually happening right now in one of the museums, where they're taking DOS and saying, rather than just evaluating ourselves, let's actually look whether we're producing this from the beginning, or when we create an after-school program or a city environment, let's actually kind of teach to the test. Let's really use this as a framework, and then we assess. And this is how I would like to end. This is how I think we need to go work with data. So this is not anymore accountability data in the traditional sense, but this is continuous quality improvement, but also framework development where we can use kind of the big data that is now available, make it very inexpensive, because we can now offer this to lots of organizations. Say, look, you collect the data, we have the interface, send it to us, we analyze it, we send it back to you in a week. You have it then, you have in the beginning of the school year, so you don't have to just use it for evaluation, but already for programming. We can also do the same at the end. It's not costing as much as traditional evaluation. And this way you have to give us your data, it has to also stay with us, but we give it back to you as well. And we can actually track and trace a whole field. So by now we have, for example, the common instrument, we have about 60,000. So it becomes research without being like fully research. So it's kind of a service, but it can be used for research. We can actually create new scales, kind of bring those scales into the process relatively easily. It's much easier with the IRB because it's a service, not only research. So we need to get secondary permission from the IRB, not primary. So it makes actually the whole process much easier and interactive and a partnership. And that's what we want to share with you, because we think that there's something there to kind of both build a field, get data, continuously give the data to the field, but also have it to track kind of progress in the field. So this is kind of the end. Thank you.
So let's grab our pizzas and then our drinks, and then we can
have a discussion. Good. Okay. Well, I didn't know that this came with pizza. It's great. I would have accepted the invitation faster.